Welcome to Week 6 of English 301, The Rise of the Individual in American Literature and Identity, 1820 to 1865. Given that one of the central goals of the Norton Anthology of American Literature is to define a national tradition in American literature, you may question why you are being asked to read a selection of texts that emphasize section, region, and hemisphere as the frame of reference for understanding the literature and culture of the United States. This is a legitimate question and one we can use to our advantage to generate discussion about how we use the literary and cultural documents to define ourselves as a nation. Every period of American literary history is filled with moments that call into question our desire to fix and stabilize national identity as one thing or another. The antebellum period, in particular, presents us with a moment where national identity was in a tremendous state of flux, as sectional conflict, racial tension, and debates over expansionism challenged any unitary or stable notion of what it meant to be American. What role does the individual's perspective, or a growing sense of individualism, which we see in certain works of American literature written in this period, play in conceptions of American identity in this era? This is the moral map of the U.S., published in the abolitionist tract, The Legion of Liberty, 1847. Although the map presents an abolitionist perspective of the United States, it nonetheless conveys beliefs about the country shared by North and South alike at that time, an increasing concern about the intractability of racial division, a sense of the nation's important connections to the larger continent, with the free Canadas to the north and the potentially vulnerable and thus darkening Mexican territories to the southwest, a view of the West as not belonging to a particular country and thus as available to expansionists, and the idea suggested throughout the darker shadings of South Florida that the borders of the nation, perhaps through annexation, could possibly descend into the Caribbean. The first two texts in this section of the Norton Anthology of American Literature, those by Webster and Sims, retain at one level a strong sense of what national identity has meant to generations of Americans, a common connection to the heritage of the New England Puritans, Webster, and a belief in the New World that is substantially different from life in the Old World, Sims. Consider the moments in these texts where these authors seem to be identifying a shared conception of American identity, and then consider how we could point to the places in the text where each author invokes some tension or conflict in antebellum culture, such as the discussion of the African slave trade in Webster, which is quoted in this slide, or Sims' insistence that there is common character of our people, referenced in the subsequent slide, despite the radical differences in climate and geography throughout the United States. After reading the Webster quotation from the previous slide and the Sims quotation on this slide, consider the following questions. What seems to carry the day in these texts? The commonalities in American culture or the differences? Are these texts defined by a tension between uniformity and difference, or do the authors actively seek to silence difference in the name of unity? Sims describes regional differences as part of the rich variety in American life, whereas Webster describes these differences as stemming from radically different political visions, slavery in the South, freedom in the North. Can these two visions coexist as describing the same nation? The chestnut piece provides an interesting and fun transition from the tensions in Webster and Sims into some of the other texts in this series, which more overtly challenge a notion of national unity. Chestnut's narrator acts as a fly on the wall to the debate, which she dryly introduces with the opening comment, quote, "In the parlor we had a scene," end quote, about the differences between people from the northern, southern, and western portions of the United States. Chestnut's window into the debates over national identity that would spring up even amid the decorum of a hotel parlor can remind readers of the anxiety over what it meant to be American that was simmering throughout the antebellum period. You may also notice that Chestnut neglects to mention race. The various participants in the debate are all white, despite the fact that the regional and sectional discord they allude to necessarily involve people of color, African American slaves in the South and displaced Mexicans and Native Americans in the West. In the passage quoted on this slide, Chestnut describes the Civil War as, quote, a divorce. How appropriate a metaphor is this for the strife between North and South? Many of the other texts included in the Norton Anthology of American Literature not only highlight race as an important, if not central, source of conflict at this time, but also call attention to the ways in which U.S. national identity in North America was caught up in an ideological, not to mention geographic, give and take with the other nations in the Western Hemisphere. A text such as De Zavala's Journey to the United States of America provides a Mexican perspective on U.S. politics. The question that De Zavala uses to start out the selection, quoted in this slide, is an excellent starting point for a discussion of American identity. What example had the United States set for other nations by the mid-19th century? What example had it set regarding independence from a foreign power, regarding its indigenous populations, regarding democracy? After considering these points, look through the De Zavala excerpt and see what conclusions he drew. Does this portrayal of the example of the United States mean different things to Americans and non-Americans of that era than it means to us now? Dana's 2 years before the mast questions what will become of the United States should California, with its large Spanish-speaking population, be admitted into the Union. Dana's suspicion about California's place in the United States contrasts nicely with O'Sullivan's unqualified enthusiasm at the prospect of annexation. This image from the 17th century depicts California as an island, a misconception that, by the 19th century, had been long since refuted. Nevertheless, California continued to be perceived as a different, separate space, somehow ideological incompatible with the United States. Read the opening lines from Dana, where he writes, quote, "The Californians are an idle, thriftless people and can make nothing for themselves," end quote, and consider Dana's reservations about integrating California into the United States. The image on this slide is John Gass' painting American Progress, 1872. How might you explicate the various elements of the painting? The angel of progress pointing Americans westward, the light coming from the east that casts away the darkness in the west, the Native Americans receding from the white settlers, the telegraph lines and railroad tracks that follow on the heels of covered wagons. How do these images confirm O'Sullivan's message in annexation? How do both the painting and O'Sullivan's text make America's westward expansion seem inevitable, even divinely mandated? Whitfield's poem, Stanzas for the 1st of August, which commemorates the end of the British slave trade in the West Indies, is another example of how to redefine the African American experience by thinking beyond national borders, as is Delaney's Political Destiny of the Colored Race on the American Continent, which takes an explicitly transnational approach to situating race and national identity within the history of the world and the geography of the globe. Whitfield does not appeal to the Declaration of Independence or other U.S. documents to call for an end to slavery, as activists such as Frederick Douglass often would. Rather, he looks to the end of the British slave trade for an example to the United States. What is the rhetorical value of such a move? How does it, or how could it, affect U.S. politics by looking beyond national boundaries? Similarly, Howe's trip to Cuba provides an American perspective on the island nation at a time when many Americans predicted that much of Central America and many, if not all, of the Caribbean islands would be annexed into the United States. Howe's depiction of slave life in Cuba also demonstrates how antebellum Americans could change the terms of the debate over slavery by looking outside the United States. Consider Howe's attitude toward the Cubans and the descriptions that she gives of their appearance and habits. What specific words reveal her attitude? What relationship does she want to cultivate between Cuba and the United States? The image you see here is an 1862 map of Cuba created by A.J. Johnson. This concludes this week's video lecture. If you have any questions about its contents and/or the corresponding texts and contexts, please contact your instructor and/or consult Norton's Study Space site.